This is an addendum of a bit of an elaboration of some of the conceptual things that I skimmed over a bit too quickly in my first take on these things. After uh, waking up in the morning, right now, I've just been going over in my mind what it is that I was even seeing when I was watching this debate or this discussion between Rationality Rules and Stefan Molyneux, and it gives me further grounds to more clearly elaborate the kind of disjunction occurring intellectually. So it's hard to even see exactly what's happening because it's in this murky secondary economy that has been manufactured in essence by Rationality Rules style of discourse, which I mean I would generally characterize as a kind of intellectual fraud. But you see, like what's happening is that um, Stefan Molyneux is attempting to say that he's not breaking the is or the is ought dichotomy, and rationality rules operates in much the same way that Stefan Molyneux does on this topic. Um, Stefan Molyneux would have been much better to more clearly, in a principled way, underline or let's say to underscore um, the implicit contention that rationality rules is trying to effectively uh, uh, continually bash Stefan over the head with, which is something like that the is ought dichotomy and the importance of having that dichotomy kept distinct in one's thinking is canonically represented by the difference between the hypothetical imperative and the categorical imperative, which in some sense was never positively substantiated in the discussion by rationality rules. He just assumes it, even though essentially it was already disparaged right from the start, right from even mentioning the categorical imperative. It was disparaged by Stefan. But instead of making this positive claim that the categorical imperative and the hypothetical imperative distinction is a canonical inculcation of keeping the is or dichotomy disparate or distinct, uh, uh, rationality rules never bothers to do that legwork, and so he continues to leverage that almost that hidden contention against Stefan, and then Stefan essentially is having to prove a negative against this vague and veiled um, superior authority and orthodoxy being leveraged against him. And so all rationality rules has to do is sort of cast these accusations, these aspersions, and then Stefan Molyneux making a counter argument. Rationality rules can merely continue to say, "Oh, you're not hitting the mark. You haven't met the negative. Um, uh, you you haven't proven the negative thesis." So he can just sort of hold the high ground in that sense, and so not having to make a positive contention, not having to substantiate the premise that his entire sort of intellectual fraud is built on. Um, and in some sense, I've already given an example in my um, first recording on this matter as to how essentially you can dispense with the canonical necessity of having this kind of distinction, because in some sense um, this distinction is only rationality rules is not even using this distinction intelligently. So the is or dichotomy in some sense is to I haven't thought about this to any great deal, so I'm not going to probably express it in the most sort of pristine kind of way. But It's something like this. It's like uh, is that because you cannot derive an ought from an is, but that doesn't mean um, hmm, that doesn't mean that is statements can't cohabit ought statements, right? So uh, can't be in parallel expressed, you know. So the idea that if you've got something, that doesn't mean that something that has an is um, claim around it, that it can't be a conduit and a transmitter of an ought claim that would sort of you know. So to even call it a dichotomy in some sense is is a conceptual heuristic which in some sense needs a positive substantiation. It needs a further elaborated context. You know, you need to sort of expound onto how this is in some sense it's not a, you know, it's being leveraged as a false dichotomy in some sense when it's not. It's being used as a false dichotomy when it's just meant to be a simple conceptual dichotomy, you know. So I mean, it's. I mean, to talk about equivocation, there you go. That is a fundamental equivocation that rationality rules is employing in some sense so nakedly, so pornographically, so out in the open. You know, I mean, how does this intellectual fraud fly by? And in some sense, um, so I mean, so Stefan Molyneux, in some sense, is being cowed by essentially not being because he's being so let's say I mean in some sense I mean this is how rationality rules works because he's being so demeaning, so sadistically edged, he's being so accusatorial in some sense. um, Stefan Molyneux is trying to entertain, you know, those the things that he's saying in so much good faith to some degree that he's trying to sort of counter it on the technical level, when actually what is really called for is a kind of character assassination, is a kind of counterpoint in terms of the bad faith of the intellectual merit of the thing itself. And you know, if you think about it to some degree, you know, the kinds of counterclaims, you know, you have to make it's not like that is just such a pathetic fucking argument. That is such a fabricated intellectual fraud that you are doing, you know. And it's like obviously that holds no water, and because it's such a like a naked sort of power grab of intellectual superiority, it's, you know, it's just it's so disgusting to even, if you make that kind of accusation, if you have to make that kind of counter accusation or counterclaim in a discussion, in a debate, I mean, it really undermines the credibility of the exercise itself, which is why I say, you know, the error of Stefan here was even giving a platform of engagement with someone of this caliber. Um, and then I'll say as well that the and this is similar to the begging the question sort of thing, where you can see rationality rules makes this very dry technical sort of thing that if you make any kind of thing that fits the form of begging the question, then that is how I am free to interpret what you are doing as begging the question. You see, I mean, on this level, I do, I mean, as I say, I haven't read the base work or whatever, but I think I gave a very good account as to why essentially something that would take the form of begging the question would serve as a perfect heading, as a heading of arguments. Um, and, you know, in some sense, if you don't trust the other person to know what begging the question is, and you're going to interpret a device of decomposition of complexity and a way to sort of, you know, in some sense, I explained how essentially you could use something that would look as if the form of begging the question um, retrieve subcomponents and reiterations. Because if you can derive um, uh, uh, what was I going to say? But if you can derive equivalent um, uh, iterative components of your subject, and you can say, well, these two things are equivalent, then obviously, as long as you're not using that as a source of proof, but you're using that as a as essentially a kind of semantic elaboration, then in some sense you've just made your work harder for you for yourself, because essentially then you're saying, I'm passing the buck to not just having to prove this one thing, but having to prove both of these things, and these things are different, and I'm saying that they're equivalent. So then you have to make further arguments to prove, I mean, in some sense, that I mean, on a technical level, part of that is just going to be a kind of a semantic postulate, that you're just going to postulate that these two things must be regarded as equivalent, and then as long as you beseech yourself to prove both independently as having some kind of, then you've just given, through the begging the question, you've given yourself a anyway, I'm just basically saying that it's not a device that's used to supply a proof of something. It's a device used to extend. Okay, I don't really see the need of technically laying this out, but essentially it's in some sense it's a way to make the subject harder and more complicated for yourself, so that then when you are forced to explain it and ground it and interrelate it with itself, you've got more moving parts that you have to calibrate, that you have to make sure that they do cogently work together and interrelate. And in some sense, that is what is being deployed in some sense a heading or a title of argument, which I don't, something that looked like it was begging the question. Obviously, that's the perfect, because that is a conceptual heading, as a conceptual title of the work that, in some sense, there's no point in just creating this very brittle rational chain of logic. In some sense, it can be hard to follow if you don't give the reader or the audience a clue as to, like, what you're trying to amount it into, or what it's sort of what you're seeking to prove. So in some sense, it's a kind of, when you're begging the question as a title of argument, it's a roadmap as to your conclusion. You're telling the reader what your intended conclusion is. And so obviously, to interpret it, and so, like, on some technical level, if you're going to read these things and interpret them as begging the question, rather than taking, in their context, what the and then I mean, I can just imagine that, with that kind of intellectual bad faith, it's impossible for Reality Rules to sort of escape his own cerebral histrionic tendency, essentially, and to not essentially, because he's just picked out this kind of this low grade threshold of, okay, well, you've tripped over my specifications, my imposition of technical, interpretive alarm bells, and that's all he will ever need, you know. And it's why would you subject yourself to that in terms of I mean, to me, you know, the fault really lies on Stefan Molyneux for not being more aggressive about like underscoring the lack of positive substantive, you know, and to me, I mean, I know why that is. It's because um, Rationality Rules leverages this kind of this very dark, kind of sadistically edged, corrosive, cerebral histrionic, you know, tendency, which, you know, he kind of which grew in this vat of, you know, sort of village atheism, scientism, cultism, and which has, you know, come to characterize leftist politics, or to call it leftist sort of hurts me a bit, but the so-called leftist politics, which is this kind of corrosive, essentially. I mean, I I usually characterize it as you know, the kind of bandwagon that it is, to me, looks very much like a kind of fascistic style. But I mean, I can't. I don't actually. I haven't surveyed Rationality Rules' work enough to know where he actually falls with identity politics. But his, um, it seems, some of his views, which are skeptical of liberalism, would tend me to believe that, you know, he's in that kind of rational alignment, that kind of brittle rational alignment of, you know, needing canonical categorical distinctions to make sense of the world, and to, you know, make, you know, and the kind of moralizing um, that are prone to that kind of that armchair, you know, that strange relativistic paradox, that where the hell are you judging this from, you know, like where, you know, judging what from, how are you judging the system, and from where are you purveying over the system, you know, like where are you standing when you judge in this disembodied sort of sense. And, you know, like that's the problem of relativism in a nutshell. And in some sense it's only fixed by, you know, it is true that on a kind of, on a more general sense, Rationality Rules does play havoc with essentially everyone else that he disagrees with in some kind of sentiment or something like that. They are, um, I mean, I do think that the argument that he has against UPB is characteristic. I mean, I'm extrapolating this from limited data, but I would say that in some sense, this is how the histrionic functions in general, is that uh, everyone else is contravening some kind of dichotomy which is canonical and important, and they themselves are not uh, um, what's the word, contravening that dichotomy. And, you know, how they know that, they don't really think about that in a judicious way. They don't really think about that in a very broad conceptual way. Somehow, like, you know, what they're doing is special and rational. You know, like, and that's the really the sort of this thread of blind faith that has to come from this sort of this extracting the truth from extracting this kind of logical matrix from a veiled truth, uh, which is either being projected onto that veiled truth, or it's being extracted from that veiled truth, and that they are the spokesperson thereof. You know, because when they deal with these things and extract heuristics, their heuristics are sort of untainted because they have good intentions. You know, it's and other people don't have good intentions because they just nakedly start with their assumptions, whereas the assumptions of the starting heuristics that are extracted at the base of rationality rules, you know, schema, and way of judging the world is a kind of is a pure attempt to just kind of make something in the model of rationality, to sort of make a heuristic that is like a kind of a a uh, uh, a, it is attempted to make a kind of device or a mechanism that is in the image of the veiled truth or something like that, which is rationality and logic itself. So because they've got this kind of mimetic purity at the heart of their project, you know, their totalitarianism is more arbitrary. Therefore, somehow it's more it's arbitrary in the image of the kind of the veiled absolute truth or the veiled logical matrix, which everything else must be strewn in. So it's a kind of, I mean, that's why I call it a kind of a faith-based position and a kind of blind faith-based. It's just that like their esotericism is sacrosanct and pure, and everybody else's is nakedly if someone creates an alternative metric in some sense, to just trying to replicate the metaphysical boundaries, that if you're not trying to make a kind of a guidance system that isn't in the image of the kind of the greater postulated metaphysical boundary of the veiled truth. In some sense, this is how the shadowy component of the in some sense, therefore the operative schema of something like Rationality Rules is something that is fundamentally corrosive. It's something that's fundamentally has to be sadistically edged, because it has to aggressively seek to dismantle things that don't have the same style of reasoning in the dark, as it were. And it's kind of entrenched in that very particularized investment into that kind of darkness, that essentially the style of that self-imposed ignorance must be conserved, because that's the only way that it knows that it's still the spokesperson of the veiled truth, or the extraction from the veiled truth is a valid transcription within their metaphysic. So you're dealing with someone who is just as stupid as any theist. It's just that their description of God is more sanctimonious and such. So I mean, this is how I characterize pseudo-intellectuals like this, is that they are no different from theists. It's just that like their God is veiled beyond an impenetrable barrier. So they do have a God. It's just that like they've got added esoteric features in their religion, which is that you can't know him. And in some sense, we have to model and create a mechanism that looks like the shape of his of how he is missing. We have to make essentially an intellectual compensation religion that is in the outline of how we know that of the boundary that puts him beyond us. And so essentially it's a secondary economy of the boundary, of the limit. We have to conserve this limit because it's all we have to base any kind of certainty off of. And it can only prove itself by essentially imposing that limit on others as a kind of viral contagion. And so all they can do is essentially continually table thump that same kind of claim in different iterative manifestations or presentations, and essentially that becomes a style which becomes a rational alignment of facts, and it ends up creating also this paradoxical relativism in some sense, where it's like, well, where are you judging this from? You're not judging it from inside your skull. You're creating this disembodied hypothetical third person God's eye point of view, which takes on the character of this veiled truth in some sense, which they make themselves the spokesperson there too. So, you've got enough of a tightly wound, convoluted, sort of piss poor, metaphysical or philosophical arrangement, and then it has to sort of it can't be honest about what it's doing itself. It has to believe that it's the only game in town in some sense. And essentially, the only way that they can argue against people is by trying to weaponize logic and rationality, and try to extract canonical heuristics that will be useful tools to corrode everything that doesn't conform to their so in some sense it just operates from that level as a kind of as a skepticism, and it uses the same stupid intellectual tricks that skeptics use, which somehow they speak for the default, they speak for the average common sense, reasonableness. And I mean, and usually they just keep on making these sorts of things because their own community forgives them, because they're all playing the same stupid game in some sense. And in some sense, it's actually, to watch this intellectual fraud in progress is very disgusting, because they all have to sort of make the same dips. They all have to, as a group, as a culture in some sense, it just becomes a kind of it just becomes an inculcated dogma that, like, you apply the corrosive test this way and you don't apply it another way, because it could very easily corrode itself. It really could. But essentially, because of the kind of the collateral conformity of the community, they don't see their own hypocrisy and their own inconsistency. It just doesn't come up, because it's like, oh well, it's just done that's how you fudge this particular intellectual kind of issue. And because it just ends up being a kind of, it's ironic, because they end up producing all the fallacious, logical moves that they use against other people. It's just, for them, it's confected into their kind of culture of how the script is supposed to look, and everything just becomes a kind of a bank of scripts, and there's no point in deviating from the script, because the script has already been tried and tested in some sense to meet the checklist of essentially the mimicry that's at the core of this very corrosive sort of bullshit. Okay, I realize that I've strayed quite further than just talking about this issue, but anyway, just to remind everyone, I do see this as leveraging a kind of a false dichotomy, which is based on a kind of equivocation, where the simple dichotomy has been leveraged and transformed into a false dichotomy, and that was done in an intellectually fraudulent way, where even if you can say that, oh well, it was just accepted, it should have already been accepted, that essentially I was holding the orthodox default position that other philosophers, it's always this reference to other philosophers, and this, so I didn't have to make a substantive claim, I didn't have to make a positive point that the other person had, so it's always this unilateral the imposition of the burden of proof, which then allows them essentially to sit back and not have to and simply, as a kind of royalty, just, oh no, you haven't proved the negative there, oh no, look, I've just sidestepped your counter argument. And in some sense, yeah, Stefan Molyneux would have done better to say no, you have to try to shift the burden of proof, and essentially to say no, 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 you can't. You can't get me to be on the defensive yet. You're missing a positive claim. You're missing a substantive claim um, that you haven't yet made. Like, why should I be doing this? Why should I have to meet this criteria that you've just laid out? Like, why is why is this criticism pertinent to me? You haven't yet made enough of a case, or you haven't developed your claim in a proper context. And you can see how all of this was triggered. It was triggered by essentially creating a such a fraudulent kind of trap in the sense of, okay, so if I make the claim that language has meaning, am I doing UPB? And it's like, and the real question, the real answer to that question was basically like, that doesn't have enough context. Like the real answer to that question is, so the compulsion is that, well, the answer to that question must be yes or no. And the actual answer to that question was something like neither. And because the actual answer to that question, because of the almost the implicit premise was yes or no, and because Stefan Molyneux sort of just bought into that he wanted to say, well, yes and no, in some sense, just to kind of be fully descriptive and fully responsive in some sense, when instead he should have known, dealing with someone with this level of intellectual bad faith and that there's fraud going on, that he should have said, there is no answer at this point, rather than saying, okay, well, in pure sort of conceptual connotative implication, according to UPB, in a conceptual sense, yes, but in terms of the using that thing, using that actually deploying that conceptual philosophy, there's a difference between understanding a philosophy and being a practitioner of it, as it were. And so, and then you've already triggered Rationality Rules' academic irrelevance, sort of trying to bash Stefan over the head with the same bullshit the whole time. Well, and then now you've just created a whole set of semantic opportunities for Rationality Rules to snidely interject the whole time. Oh, that sounds like equivocation. Oh, you see, now you're equivocating again, and this reinforces my earlier point. It's just it's I can make that point a bit better. The tripwire has already been activated, so it's like at that point it's yeah, I mean it's juvenile to watch. It just looks disgusting to me. I'm not now. I'm not describing it well, but there wasn't. I mean, I'm just repeating myself at this point. But yeah, I mean, in some sense, this is part of the course when you're dealing with this kind of um, skeptical language games in some sense, but no, I was going to make a sort of a broader metaphysical point as well, but okay, no, never mind. That's a different. Okay, well, at this point, I don't think I'm going to add anything new, so I should probably stop the recording. Yeah, I mean, just psychologically, there's a lot to sort of, and philosophically, there's a lot to sort of, in terms of the aspects of the exchange that, um, oh yeah, I mean, I was just almost going to, in my mind, replay the initial moves and the kind of, I mean, to me, it really is interesting how technically hypocritical this thing functions. You know, it really does have that weird sort of thing where it does fall foul of all the things that it complains about, and it really is ironic to such a high degree, and essentially it doubles down on its accusations in order, because it has to, in order to shield itself from essentially its own fundamental intellectual bad faith, which in some sense the bad faith is such a sophisticated machination that it, you know, yeah. So I mean, like if you watch the exchange, right, and if you, and this is what I was trying to do, but I sort of lost my own thread, is that you just kind of pause it and you say, what is rationality rules implying? And if you just elaborate what he is implying, and you put it in a positive claim, and then you track that positive argument that he doesn't make. Obviously, you see, this is the problem, is because he never makes it. There's no fixed target that Stefan can defeat, that he can even confront. He can't confront his accuser, essentially. And so, because this, and no doubt, if he did try to push that avenue, there would have been even I bet there would have been exasperation on the part of Rationality Rules. I bet he would have sort of, then you would have seen the full deployment of vulnerable narcissism. You know, you really would have seen this exasperated, self-pitying, self-referencing, sort of aspersion making accusation, because that is the sacred space, that is the subjective sacred space, and for the histrionic, and they would really then you'll see the deployment of the toxic, sort of the leveraging of the boundaries and the limits, and the sort of the passing the buck, or the exteriorization of blame, as to, like, oh, you can't expect me to have to make a positive claim. Okay, this is completely hypothetical, so I mean, I will try to contain myself to some degree, but essentially, I mean, I'm extrapolating this from it not being said, because the fact that this is not delivered preemptively, the fact that this was not part of Rationality Rules, is, that he did not broach the subject himself, that he did not feel the need to do it, and in fact, when it was directly indicated and called for, if your whole intellectual edifice is going to be based on this distinction, when that distinction is not agreed upon, if that essential distinction between the categorical imperative and the hypothetical imperative is not, has already been disparaged by the other side, like, how can you take that to be the canonical representation of the necessity of having an is-ought dichotomy, which in some sense there was. I mean, I can make the bridge right there, which is that, well, the categorical imperative, or something representing the categorical imperative, is indicated, or at least is not sufficiently indicated by the use of hypothetical imperatives. But there's nothing in hypothetical imperatives that, in the use, especially in the use of hypothetical imperatives, that negates the underlying existence, or the cohabitation of a categorical esque influence within the hypothetical, the construct of the hypothetical imperative. I could define, I could probably lay that out in a more pristine sort of way, but the idea that the is-ought dichotomy means that hypothetical and categorical imperatives must be pristinely, sort of segregated, and that one, something can be one and not the other, or something like that. This is an academic conceptual distinction, which needs further positive substantive claims as to why that the distinction between it's more the distinction between something that is a pure categorical imperative versus a system that involves the implication of a categorical imperative and only contends in or with hypothetical imperatives, why essentially some kind of cohabitation, conceptual superimposition of the one on the other is unfit relative to one in which there's essentially a false dichotomy between the two. This whole matter is not taken in good faith, is not positively contended by rationality rules. It's just because somehow the governance of rationality, he's already the regent of such, so he doesn't have to go through the legwork. Okay, sorry, I need to stop this recording. I'm just going to also expound on one more thing now. This is an added on recording anyway. Is the level of conceptual arbitrariness used speciously or pre-selectively, or according, so even the categorical imperative itself, why does that hold any great water in some sense? Like, you have to understand why, I can roughly map on why the distinction between hypothetical imperatives and categorical imperatives are relevant to the is-ought dichotomy. But if you just actually intelligently conceive of that for any length of time, you realize that this kind of game that Rationality Rules is playing is again, it's just intellectually pathetic. It's irrelevant. It's a trumped up, made up academic distinction. So categorical imperatives somehow are magical in Rationality Rules' mind because they just automatically pertain to moral agents. But you could turn that into a hypothetical. Well, it only applies if you are a moral agent. Really, so if essentially you're saying that Stefan Molyneux' whole system of thinking is only hypothetical, where's the should, you have to condition it, you have to qualify it at the start of everything. Well, if the fucking qualification is, well, it applies to anything that takes on the form of any hypothetical imperative, the new PB sort of kicks in some sense, as long as it applies to anything where essentially your motivation or your will or your intentionality is being expressed. then it kicks in. If you actually want to do the things that you say that you want to do, if you actually have, in the context of any purpose, it kicks in. Then, I mean, excuse me, but that's fucking universal enough. I mean, it's kind of the same league of, well, you already have to concede that what you're dealing with, it only works if what you're dealing with is a moral agent. I mean, like it's and so when I say academic distinctions, I guess I'm making the complaint that he's making these distinctions where he hasn't proven or shown or made a positive claim as to why it makes a difference in the sense that it should make a difference. But I'm sure he would use some kind of clever sophistry and say, "Oh no, it's not for me to supply the should. You have to say why you shouldn't have to measure up to this arbitrary standard and this technical red tape that I'm imposing because I have the authority. I have the kind of the metaphysical credential. I hold the default. I hold the orthodoxy. Like somehow my subjective view on this is the canonical view that all philosophers have generally agreed on, for all time or something like that. Or this is how it's generally understood. Like that's the okay, I realize that I'm extrapolating that. But I mean, that is the attitude, and you can see that quite clearly, and you can see that in how he. I mean, I guess it's true that I haven't read the source material, so I don't know, if the begging. But I mean, I think people know, at a certain level, people know if they're begging the question, and if they're essentially doing it as a device, as essentially a kind of pedagogical, because as I've already explained, it's a very useful device for getting people to show people what your jargon is and what within your own semantic system, what words you're postulating have an equivalent weighting or you are declaring by postulate in essence your semantic equivalencies, and then as long as essentially you've expanded the ambit of the thing that you have to prove then. So then as long as you've got further supporting explorations and explanations of how those words separately sort of impinge on one another, in terms of, so in some sense, some things cannot be proven until you make it more complicated, because then you've got more moving parts that you have to contend with and sort of expound on and so I mean but I mean obviously in that level of complexity, in that level of sophisticated, let's say, philosophical exploration, it becomes harder to impose false dichotomies. So someone like Rationality Rules would obviously just sort of take the quickest out and say, oh no, that's begging the question. Like I don't care about what's actually being explained here. You've tripped over one of my booby traps. So it's again. I mean, I feel like I'm decomposing to Stefan Molyneux why he was wasting his time to begin with. And in some sense, I mean, I don't think it's ever valuable to watch someone do this, other than perhaps to come to the realization of the things that I'm sort of trotting out here, is why this kind of brittle intellectualism is just not worth engaging in. It's like bucket fishing, It's like and in some sense, it's like when people debate skeptics, hard skepticism, it's that level of being trolled. Rationality Rules is really no different than any kind of I was thinking this before I made any of these recordings, that it's a level of no, I can't remember. I had like a nice little aphorism, like I can't remember what the other part was, but it was like troll and something else, but I can't remember now. Anyway, and I mean, in some sense, the only way to actually contend with a troll like this, and I mean, it would be difficult for me even uh, to contend with this because once they've got their scent of blood, once they've deployed their sadistically, once they've found a vector to deploy their sadistically edged, sort of aspersions, and they've sort of completely deployed the secondary intellectual fraud, and they've got that sort of economy running within the discussion. Um, it's kind of already too late. You have to preempt it. If you don't preempt it, in the sense, then you've got no hope because then they will literally just keep on beating you with their stupid stick. So, like the point at which this whole thing turned sour, when Stefan Molyneux should have said, the context does not indicate a yes or a no. It's undefined at that point. Like if you say that language has meaning, are you really doing UPB? Um, you could see even the container that they sort of agreed to within their own argument, which was, like, I mean, when he asked Steph to steelman the categorical imperative, and Steph, right from the start, essentially just disparaged the categorical imperative. Already there, I guess, I mean, hindsight is 2020. Like that. That could have been its own sort of intellectual sort of discussion. And it was a disjointed way of actually bringing that into the argument to ask somebody else to steelman the categorical imperative. And this might have a greater context of arguments that were made a long time ago, and I haven't watched that source material, nor do I wish to. But anyway, I've given at least my intellectual treatment of those topics, so I don't feel the need to. Um, but yeah, so I mean, it's perhaps slightly unfair that I'm just looking at this limited window, but I mean, again, like all the stylistic critique that I have surmounted, I think that stands independently. So, yeah, okay. I think this topic is finished now.